I have to be honest with you about something I used to get wrong. For years, I told people not to worry. I told them, by the time you hit 80, you won't want business class to Paris anymore. You won't be eating at $200 restaurants. Your spending will naturally wind down. The math works itself out, and the spreadsheets backed me up. Most retirement calculators are built on this assumption. You hit 75, and the model just quietly trims your spending by 1% a year. It feels responsible, reassuring, even, like you've thought of everything. I hadn't thought of everything. What I was measuring was want-based spending. Travel, restaurants, hobbies, all the things that make retirement feel like retirement. And yes, that number does soften with age. Your body slows down. Your appetites change. The $15,000 European trip becomes a long weekend 2 states over. But I was confusing lifestyle spending with survival spending. And those two things do not move in the same direction. There's a second number that nobody puts in their spreadsheet. It doesn't show up until your late 70s or early 80s. And when it arrives, it doesn't ask for permission. That number has a name. I call it the care rate. Today, we're going to take apart the $5 million math. You'll see exactly why it holds up beautifully at 65 and why it can quietly collapse at 85 if you haven't planned for this one specific thing. Let's run the numbers the way most financial planners do. Not to tear them down, because this part is actually correct. Say you want to spend $180,000 a year after taxes in retirement. That's $15,000 a month. Business class occasionally. Nice dinners. A vacation home, or at least a few good trips. That's a genuinely wealthy retirement by any measure. Now, Social Security. A married couple who both worked solid careers and claims at full retirement age can reasonably collect around $72,000 a year combined under current 2026 rules. That's real money coming in every year, inflation adjusted, requiring zero draws from your portfolio. So your portfolio only needs to cover the gap $108,000 a year. At the standard 4% withdrawal rate, that means you need about $2,700,000 in investable assets. Round up generously for taxes, sequence of returns risk, inflation buffer, you land somewhere between $3,500,000 and $4 million. $5 million clears that bar with room to spare. I can't tell you what the market does next quarter. I can't predict whether inflation runs at 3% or 5% over the next decade. But the underlying arithmetic of the 4% rule has held across some genuinely ugly market periods. $5 million gives you a cushion that, on paper, is hard to argue with. And that's exactly what the financial industry does argue with. You've probably seen the headlines. You need $10 million to retire comfortably. Most Americans are dangerously underprepared. Some of that is legitimate concern. Some of it is firms that charge 1% annually on assets under management, and 1% of $10 million is twice as much as 1% of $5 million. $5 million is genuinely sufficient for the lifestyle question. The problem was never the burn rate. Burn rate is the part that behaves. It plateaus. It softens. It follows a fairly predictable curve as you age. At $5 million, you've solved for burn rate. What you haven't solved for is a completely different cost structure that doesn't plateau, doesn't soften, and doesn't care what your spreadsheet says. $5 million is more than enough, as long as your health and your spouse's health stay on a clean parallel track into your 80s. That's the condition nobody writes in the footnotes. There's a theory in retirement planning that a lot of people find genuinely comforting. It goes like this. Your retirement has 3 phases. The go-go years. when you're active and spending freely. The slow-go years, when travel gets harder and you naturally pull back. And the no-go years, when you're mostly home and your expenses drop to almost nothing. It's a clean model, easy to visualize, and it contains just enough truth to be dangerous. Because here's what actually happens with the engineers, the managers, the people who spent 30 years building something substantial. They reach 62 with $4 million saved. By every model, they're done. They could stop tomorrow. But they don't. Not because they want a bigger boat. Not because they're chasing one more promotion. They keep working because stopping feels like stepping off a ledge in the dark. There's a fear they can't quite name. Not of running out of money exactly, but of something going catastrophically wrong in a way they haven't modeled yet. So they work one more year, then another. Psychologists call part of this the accumulation trap. Your brain spends decades in acquisition mode. Save more, earn more, protect the number. Switching that off at 62 or 63 doesn't happen automatically. The mental operating system doesn't update just because the math says you're ready. And the go-go, slow-go, no-go model gives that hesitation a respectable sounding cover story. I'll spend more in my 60s and early 70s, slow down in my mid-70s, and by 80 my costs will be minimal. It lets you feel financially sophisticated while avoiding the harder question of why you still can't bring yourself to spend the money you spent a lifetime building. I've watched this pattern more times than I can count. The person who delays retirement just to be safe and then gets a diagnosis at 67 that rewrites everything. The couple who finally retires at 64 spends 2 cautious years barely touching their portfolio and then wonders where the go-go years went. The instinct to keep working, to keep accumulating, that's not irrational. That low-level anxiety about something unnamed and catastrophic, it's worth listening to. It's just pointing at the wrong thing. The fear isn't really about market crashes or inflation. Those are known risks. You've planned for those. The thing that keeps the 62-year-old engineer at his desk isn't in any spreadsheet he's ever built, because most people never put it in a spreadsheet at all. Let's go back to that engineer's parents. They had a good retirement. Not lavish, but genuinely comfortable. Traveled a bit in their late 60s. Helped with the grandkids. By their late 70s, they'd slowed down the way the model predicted. Fewer trips, quieter weekends, monthly spending dropped from around $12,000 to maybe $8,000. The go-go years had wound down exactly on schedule. Then his father started having memory issues. Not dramatic at first. Small things. Getting turned around on familiar streets. Repeating the same question twice in an hour. But within 18 months, he needed memory care, a specialized facility. Staff trained for cognitive decline, secured unit, 24-hour supervision. The last trip to Europe had cost $15,000. 1 month in memory care cost $12,000. That's not a one-time expense. That's the new baseline, every single month. And here's the mechanism that most retirement plans completely miss. At age 82, your burn rate, travel, restaurants, entertainment, has dropped. Maybe you're down to $8,000 a month. Your body doesn't want what it used to want. The model was right about that part. But the care rate doesn't replace the burn rate. It stacks on top of it. You still have a mortgage or rent. You still have utilities, groceries, insurance. Your spouse is still living at home, still running a household. Those costs don't disappear because one person now needs a care facility. So the $8,000 burn rate stays, and the $12,000 care rate gets added to it. Total monthly outflow, $20,000. That's $240,000 a year. From a portfolio you designed to handle $180,000. And Medicare does not cover this. That is the part people get wrong most often. Medicare covers acute medical care, hospital stays, surgery, short-term rehabilitation. It does not cover long-term custodial care. It does not pay for the facility that helps your spouse bathe, dress, and stay oriented to where they are. That bill is entirely yours. The 2026 national median for a private room in a nursing home now runs between $120,000 and $144,000 per year. In higher cost of living states, you're looking at significantly more. I've sat with families who had $5 million saved, solid planners, careful people, and I've watched the confusion on their faces when they're signing a $12,000 check every month. Not because the money isn't there, but because the portfolio is draining at a speed nobody planned for. The sequence of withdrawals they built their whole strategy around just broke. This is what makes the care rate different from every other retirement risk. Inflation is gradual. Market downturns are temporary. Sequence of returns risk is manageable with the right structure. But a long-term care event is a step function. 1 month you're spending $8,000. The next month you're spending $20,000. And that new number doesn't come back down. $5 million sounds enormous until you're drawing it down at $240,000 a year instead of $180,000. At that pace, you're not following the 4% rule anymore. You're closer to 5% or 6%. The math that made $5 million feel safe stops working, and the IRS is about to make it worse. Here's where the $5 million plan doesn't just bend. It breaks. Most people in their late 50s and early 60s have built their wealth the way the system encouraged them to. Max out the 401k. Contribute to the traditional IRA. Take the tax deduction now, pay later. It's rational advice, and for the accumulation phase, it works exactly as advertised. The problem arrives when later becomes right now, and right now happens to be a medical emergency. Say your spouse needs memory care starting at age 82. You need $144,000 this year to cover the facility. That money is sitting in your 401k, so you withdraw $144,000. Except you don't withdraw $144,000. You withdraw closer to $200,000 because that $144,000 is pre-tax money. Every dollar you pull out gets added to your ordinary income for the year. After TCJA expired at the end of 2025, the 2026 tax brackets reverted. A large withdrawal in a single year can push a retired couple into the 28% or 32% bracket on the portion above the threshold. You needed $144,000 to pay the care facility. You had to pull $200,000 to keep $144,000 after federal taxes before state taxes. That's not a planning failure. That's the structure of tax-deferred accounts doing exactly what they were designed to do, just at the worst possible moment. And then the IRMA penalty kicks in. Medicare Part B and Part D premiums are income tested. Once your modified adjusted gross income crosses certain thresholds, your Medicare premiums increase significantly. A large 401k withdrawal in a single year, the exact kind you'd make during a care emergency, can trigger surcharges of $2,000 to $5,000 or more per person for that year. You're already drawing the portfolio down fast. Now you're also paying a penalty for doing it. This is the mechanism. It's not that $5 million is the wrong number. It's that $5 million in the wrong account structure behaves like $3,500,000 when you actually need it. Now add one more variable that almost nobody models. one spouse dies. Social Security survivor benefits mean the household keeps the higher of the two checks and loses the lower one. For a couple collecting $72,000 combined, that might drop to $42,000 or $44,000 overnight. The income falls by roughly 40%. But the house payment doesn't fall 40%. The insurance doesn't fall 40%. The utilities, the property taxes, the car, none of that moves in proportion to the income loss. Researchers call this the widow's penalty. The cost of maintaining a household doesn't scale down cleanly when it goes from two people to one. So in the same period when the portfolio is being drawn down by care costs, the income floor just dropped by $28,000 a year, and the fixed expenses stayed exactly where they were. At that point, your portfolio isn't depleting at 4% annually. Run the actual math. $200,000 in gross withdrawals to net $144,000 for care costs, plus $28,000 to replace the lost Social Security income, plus ongoing living expenses. You are drawing this portfolio down at 8%, maybe 10% in a bad sequence of returns year. $5 million at 10% annual drawdown lasts 13 to 15 years. If that care event starts at 82, the math runs out around 95 to 97. That sounds fine until you account for the surviving spouse who may live independently for another decade after the care period ends. The number that felt enormous at 65 starts looking different from the other side. You might be feeling right now the way a lot of people feel when they work through this. The system is rigged. Social Security is going to collapse. Healthcare will drain everything no matter what we do. I understand that reaction. I've read enough comments to know it's widespread. But that's not where this ends, because this is a structure problem, not a savings problem. And structure problems have structural solutions. The solution is not finding another $5 million. That framing, I just need a bigger number, is exactly what keeps people at their desks for 5 extra years they didn't need to work. The problem was never the size of the portfolio. It was that one pool of money was being asked to do 2 completely different jobs, under 2 completely different tax conditions, at 2 completely different points in time. So you separate them. The first thing to reconsider is traditional long-term care insurance. At 60, the premiums for a standalone LTC policy in 2026 are expensive, and more importantly, they carry rate increase risk. Insurers have repriced these policies dramatically over the past decade because they underestimated how long people would actually use them. You can buy a policy today and face a 40% premium increase in year 7 with limited options other than reduce your benefit or keep paying. For most people at this stage, that's not a reliable foundation. What is reliable is building a tax-free care buffer inside the accounts you already have. If you're in your early to mid-60s and not yet collecting Social Security, you are sitting in what planners call the red zone, the years between retirement and age 73 when required minimum distributions begin. Income is relatively low. Tax brackets are relatively favorable. This window will not come back. Use it for Roth conversions. Each year in the red zone, you convert a portion of your traditional 401k or IRA into a Roth account. You pay the tax now at today's rates on amounts you control. The money then grows tax-free. And when you withdraw it at 82, to pay $12,000 a month in care rate costs. That withdrawal is $0 in federal income tax. It does not count toward your modified adjusted gross income. It does not trigger IRMA surcharges. It does not stack on top of your Social Security and push you into a higher bracket. The $200,000 gross withdrawal problem from the stress test scenario disappears. You need $144,000. You take $144,000. The conversion doesn't have to be aggressive. Even moving $40,000 to $60,000 a year during a 7 to 8 year red zone window builds a Roth balance of $350,000 to $500,000 before growth. That's not a full care buffer, but it's a dedicated reserve that operates completely outside the tax system when you need it most. The second lever is your home. Most people think of home equity as retirement wealth in a general sense, something to pass on or sell if things get truly desperate. That's the wrong frame. Housing equity is your care buffer of last resort, and it should be designated as such explicitly in your plan. Not tapped for lifestyle, not refinanced to fund a renovation at 68. Held in reserve for the specific scenario where care rate costs outlast everything else. A paid-off home in 2026 carries significant equity for most people in this age range. That equity, accessed through a reverse mortgage or an outright sale, can fund years of care costs without touching the investment portfolio at all. It's not an elegant solution, but it's a real one, and most retirement plans treat it as an afterthought rather than a structural component. The difference between retiring in anxiety and retiring with clarity is not a larger number on a brokerage statement. It's knowing exactly which account is funding which phase of your life and making sure the tax structure around each one matches the moment you'll actually need it. You've already built the assets. This is just about building them in the right shape. The $5 million rule is not a lie. It's a genuinely sound answer to a genuinely important question. How much do I need to stop working and live well? The math holds. The 4% rule holds. If you've built $5 million in assets and you're 65 years old, you have solved the burn rate problem completely. What we've been talking about today is the second problem, the one that arrives quietly, about 15 to 17 years into a retirement that was going exactly as planned. You don't need another $5 million to solve it. You need a Roth conversion strategy in your 60s, a clear designation for your housing equity, and an honest accounting of what care rate actually costs. So that number has a dedicated source when it arrives, instead of landing on a portfolio that wasn't sized for it. That's the whole plan. Not more accumulation. Better structure. If any part of today's breakdown resonated, if you've watched a parent go through a care transition, or if you've felt that low-level anxiety about something you couldn't quite name, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Not the theory, the real version. What it actually cost, what surprised you, what you wish someone had told you earlier. And if you want to keep working through this kind of analysis, the gaps between what conventional financial advice says and what the numbers actually show, subscribe. That's what this channel is for.